All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that on its face might seem like, pure philosophy, but I promise you it's not just an academic exercise.
Yeah.
We're talking about this distinction between agent neutral versus agent relative reasons for action.
Right.
And for anyone who's ever, thought about what they should do or about ethics or morality, like this is a fundamental question that we need to unpack.
I mean, this really gets down to like the core of why you do anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, what are your reasons for acting? Are they focused on yourself? Are they focused on everyone?
Right. Right. And to help us really understand this distinction in detail, we're turning to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the SEP, and specifically their entry on reasons for action,
Mhm.
agent neutral versus agent relative. I mean, the SEP is a pretty well-respected, rigorous resource.
Oh, yeah.
I
Yes.
mean, this is a very, very in-depth article.
Yeah, this essay is a great resource because it really gives us a solid overview of how this idea has developed over time, and and also why it's so important, why philosophers keep coming back to this.
Yeah. So today, what we're going to be doing is kind of taking you through this philosophical distinction, unpacking all the different nuances and all the arguments. And I think this is going to be a really, really interesting conversation. So let's jump right in.
Sounds great.
So the SEPA starts by explaining, how this idea has like kind of changed over time, how it's been thought about in different ways.
Right.
And one of the earliest ways to think about this distinction is what they call the principle-based conception. And this came even before the terms agent neutral or agent relative were even used.
Yeah, I mean, you can see philosophers like Thomas Nagel, for example, in his book, The Possibility of Altruism. He's grappling with very similar ideas.
Okay.
But he's using different terms,
Yeah.
right? He's using the terms subjective and objective reasons.
Okay, interesting.
And what I think is so interesting about Nagel's approach is where he starts, which is this idea of the universality of reasons.
Okay, universality of reasons. So is that kind of like I guess the thought that if something's a good reason, it's a good reason for everyone?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So the idea is that for every reason that we have, there's this corresponding general principle,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
So Nagel's thinking if some characteristic R is true about an event A, then any person P has a reason to bring about A, right? So he's trying to ground reasons in these really broad, kind of universally applicable principles.
Right, I see. So how did he differentiate between a subjective reason, which we now call agent relative, and an objective reason, which we now call agent neutral? How did he use this universality concept to make that distinction?
Well, the key for Nagel is whether or not the defining characteristic of the event, that R that we just talked about,
Hmm.
whether it specifically mentioned the person acting the agent. Right. And he thermalized this a little bit. So he said, if the variable P for the person, if it appears freely in the description of R, then that reason is subjective, what we now call agent relative.
Okay.
And if P doesn't appear, then it's objective or agent neutral.
Okay, so I think I get that, but can we maybe make it a little more concrete? Like, can we have an example?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because that's a little...
Sure. Yeah. Let's imagine you have a reason to call a friend
Mm.
because it's going to make them happy.
Yeah.
Right. And we can frame this reason in two different ways, right?
Yeah.
So first, we could think calling someone makes them happy.
Right,
And the fact that it's your friend, that's kind of incidental.
right, yeah.
The important thing is the happiness, right?
Okay.
Okay. And so if we were to state this as one of Nagel's principles, we could say, for any person P in any action A, if A makes someone happy, then P has a reason to do A, right? So notice, the principle doesn't say anything about your friend. He doesn't mention you specifically.
Right.
It's really just about happiness in general, right? And this would be an example of what Nagel would call an objective reason, or what we now call an agent-neutral reason.
Okay, yeah, so like the general good of happiness is a reason for anyone to act.
Right. Exactly.
Where what would be the, I guess, agent relative spin on this same scenario?
Yeah, so the agent-relative reason would be something like, calling my friend makes my friend happy. Right.
Okay.
And so if we were to state this as one of Nagel's principles, it would be something like, for any person P and any action A, if A makes Key's friend happy, then P has a reason to do A.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So do you see the difference here?
Yeah, I think so.
That the first version, right, in the agent-neutral version, the condition makes someone happy. It doesn't contain the variable P, right?
Yeah.
But in the second version, in the agent-relative version, the condition makes P's friend happy. That contains P, right? So the reason is in some sense, tied to this specific relationship that you have.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the agent relative one is about my friend, and the agent neutral one is just about friends in general.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, okay. So I think I'm starting to get a better understanding of how that formal distinction works.
Great.
Now, the Seppi article also mentions this concept that Nagel has of promote, and it seems like he has a very specific idea in mind about like what it means for a reason to actually lead to an action.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So for Nagel, promote has a pretty broad meaning. It obviously includes cases of like directly causing something.
Yeah.
So you call your friend, you make them happy, you're directly promoting their happiness, right?
Yeah.
But it also includes these situations where not doing something would actually prevent some good outcome,
Okay.
right? So it's
Yeah.
not just about actively like, going out and doing good deeds.
All right.
It's also about like upholding or maintaining some kind of desirable state of affairs, right?
Okay, yeah, yeah. It's like if I didn't do this, then this good thing wouldn't happen. So therefore, I'm promoting the good thing.
Yes.
Exactly.
Even if I didn't actively make it happen.
Right.
Okay.
And Nagel actually connects this back to different ethical theories.
Yeah.
So for example, he argues that ethical egoism, which is, the idea that you should always act in your own self-interest,
Right.
he says that's agent relative.
Okay.
Right. Because it always refers back to your welfare.
Okay.
Right. And conversely, he says that objective utilitarianism, which says we should try to maximize the well-being of everyone,
Right.
that's agent neutral.
Right. Because it doesn't matter who it is, it's just about.
Exactly.
like-
It's not tied to any particular person.
Okay, so then we have Derek Parfit, who comes along, and he is like, the person who really solidified the terms agent relative and agent neutral like we use them today.
Yeah, exactly. So Parfit, he took up Nagel's ideas, but he really popularized the terms that we use today. And initially, he actually applied this distinction to like entire ethical theories.
Right. So for Parfit, an agent neutral theory, this is a theory that gives everyone like common moral aims,
Okay.
right? So think about like maximizing happiness overall, right? That's an aim that in theory everyone should be working towards, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whereas agent relative theories, these give different aims to different agents, right?
Okay.
So like ethical egoism, right?
Right.
Your aim is your happiness.
Right. Yeah. Mine is mine.
Exactly. Mine is mine, right? So we have these distinct like moral goals.
Right. Okay.
So what Parfit's doing is he's kind of shifting the focus
Okay.
from individual reasons to like the goals of morality itself.
Right. Okay. Okay. So common aims, agent neutral, different aims, agent relative.
Exactly.
Okay. And that seems to make sense. But how does that connection between theories actually map onto like the reasons themselves? How do we get back to that?
Well, think about it this way, right?
Mm.
If a theory gives us these common aims, then if there's a reason for you to promote those aims, there's going to be a reason for me to promote those aims as well, right?
Right. Yeah.
Assuming that like I'm able to do that.
Yeah.
So these would be agent neutral reasons in Parfit's sense, right? A reason for one is a reason for all, at least all who are able to act,
Okay.
right? Whereas if we have like different aims, right, then maybe there's a reason for you to do something to pursue your aims, but that's not going to give me a reason to do it. Or,
Yeah.
even if I could, easily do that thing for you.
Right. Right. Okay.
So those would be agent relative reasons.
So it seems like Parfit thought that his distinction was like basically lining up with Nagel's principle-based view.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think, one of the more interesting points that this he brings up.
Okay.
So Parfit definitely thought that his terminology was like perfectly in line with Nagel's framework, right?
Right.
And the He suggests that that connection holds up
Okay.
because Nagel built in this teleological element. Right. The idea of reasons to promote, he built that into his definition of reasons, right?
Right.
So if a reason is agent relative in Nagel's sense,
Yeah.
in the sense that it refers to some specific agent,
Right.
then your reason to promote that thing, it's not necessarily going to be a reason for me to promote it unless I have some similar connection to that outcome. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So the agent neutral reasons, right? These are the ones that are focused on like the outcome without this reference back to a specific agent.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that are naturally going to transfer across persons in Parfit's view.
Right. Okay. So as long as we kind of have this teleological view of reasons, then the two frameworks are compatible.
Exactly.
But then the SP brings up a I guess you could say, a pretty significant challenge to this whole principle-based way of thinking, which is moral particularism.
Right. Yeah, and this is a huge debate in ethics,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So philosophers like Jonathan Dancy, they argue for this thing called holism about reasons. And the basic idea here is that whether something counts as a reason for you to do something, that depends entirely on the context, right? Like the specific details of the situation can make a huge difference.
Okay, so reasons can be context dependent.
Exactly.
So it seems like that's kind of going against Nagel's idea of these universal principles.
Exactly right. So for a particularist like Dancy, the fact that, let's say, calling my friend will make him happy, that might be a reason to call him in some situations, but it might not be a reason to call him in others, right? Like maybe if I know that that happiness is, going to be derived from him doing something really immoral, then all of a sudden that pleasure is not a reason for me to call him anymore.
Right, okay, yeah.
But, the principle-based view, right, it tries to like build all these conditions
Right.
into the reason itself, right?
Yeah.
So instead of just saying pleasure, it would have to be something like innocent pleasure or pleasure that doesn't derive from, harming others or something like that, right?
Well, that you have to...
Try and get all of those necessary conditions baked into the reason itself.
Yeah. You have to specify exactly what kind of pleasure it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And particularists, they resist this. They say, no, we should stick with the more, natural description of the reason and just accept that its force can be altered by context.
Right, okay. So Nagel's idea that every reason fits into this universal principle really clashes with this holistic view.
Right.
What about Parfit? Like, how does particularism affect Parfit's take?
Yeah, well, Parfit's focus on normative theories, right?
Yeah.
That also sits uneasily with particularism.
Okay.
Because, particularism is often really skeptical of the idea that morality can be captured by these broad principles, right? But also Parfit's definition of an agent-neutral reason, right? This idea that it has to provide a reason for anyone who's able to promote the end.
Right.
Well, that also kind of clashes with the particularist idea that context always matters.
Mm-hmm.
Because, a particularist might say, look, even if something is a reason for one agent to promote some other aspect of another agent's situation, that could like totally negate that reason.
Right, yeah.
So the key point here is just the tension between general rules, right, on the one hand, and like the messy reality of particular moral situations.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the kind of classic principle-based approach, while it's very clear and it offers a good way to distinguish between agent relative and agent neutral, it doesn't really take into account this context sensitivity that the particularists are pushing.
Right.
And that brings us to the second conception that the set talks about, which is the reason statement-based conception.
Right. And this conception, it shifts the focus.
Okay.
Right. So instead of looking at these underlying universal principles, it looks at like the statement of the reason itself.
Okay.
Right. So the actual way that the reason is articulated.
Okay.
And one of the key figures here is Philip Pettit. And Pettit's idea is that an agent relative reason, it's a reason that you can't state fully without using some kind of pronoun.
Okay.
That refers back to the agent.
Okay, so words like he or his or me or my, something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
So agent neutral reasons, you can state them without this kind of pronominal back reference. But agent relative reasons, you can't.
Okay.
And this really shifts the analysis away from the level of like this really abstract principle to like the level of the actual way that we state reasons.
Okay, so we're not trying to find some universal rule. We're just looking at like the reason itself and how we would say it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Pettit gives some examples of this. So he says, agent relative reasons would be things like that he promised to perform the action, or that the action is in his interest, or that it is to the advantage of his children.
Okay.
And an agent neutral reason would be something like that the action would reduce suffering, right?
Right.
There's no like inherent reference back to a particular individual.
Right. And this seems like it could actually sidestep that issue of the universal principle, which is what the particularists were struggling with.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the potential advantages of this view.
Okay.
Right. Because by focusing on the way that we actually articulate the reason in a given context, it's much more open to the idea that, reasons don't necessarily work according to these like really rigid, context insensitive principles.
Right. Okay. But this approach also has like its own set of challenges.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what are some of those?
Well, the PIA points out that this view, it seems to kind of presuppose that we have a certain view of what reasons are,
Okay.
right? A certain ontology of reasons.
Okay.
So, for example, if you think that reasons are just facts about the world
Okay.
and that there are no like fundamentally indexical facts,
Yeah.
right? Which are facts that like inherently involve terms like this or here or me,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Then this reason statement view, it actually runs into a problem
Mm-hmm.
because think about it this way, right?
Yeah.
Um, you could have a reason like that having a beer right now would make me happy.
Right. Okay.
It
Yeah.
seems like a really clear case of an agent relative reason,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's all about me and my happiness.
Yeah.
But if the fact that having a beer at, 3.15 on a Tuesday would make your name happy, if that's just the same fact described in a different way,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And if reasons are just facts,
Right. Right.
then you can always state the reason in a way that doesn't involve me,
Right.
right?
Yeah. It would just be a fact about you
Exactly.
and the beer and your happiness. Yeah.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So then all of a sudden, it becomes really hard to see how any reason could be truly agent relative.
Yeah. Because if it just boiled down to a fact,
Yeah.
then the agent relativity kind of disappears.
Exactly. Yeah,
Exactly.
right. And so this approach, it's going to be more appealing to people who think that, reasons include some kind of like mode of presentation.
Yeah.
Or for those who think that there are these irreducibly indexical facts.
Right. Okay. Okay. So
But it's going to be, less appealing for people who have a more like purely factual view of reasons.
yeah. So it's potentially compatible with particularism, but it has its own kind of baggage.
Yeah.
Okay, and that brings us to the third way of thinking about this, which is what the SE calls the perspective-based conception.
Right. And this view, it focuses on the perspective from which we can recognize a reason,
Okay.
right? So the thought is that agent-neutral reasons, these are the ones that we can kind of appreciate from a suitably objective, impartial viewpoint,
Okay.
right? Whereas agent-relative reasons, these are the ones that like we can only really grasp from the perspective of the agent who's involved.
So like stepping back and saying like which reasons still make sense even when you're trying to be unbiased.
Exactly. And the SEPI brings up Jonathan Dancy's interpretation of Nagel here.
Okay.
Right, where he suggests that Nagel actually distinguished between these like stubbornly subjective reasons, which are just our own personal whims,
Okay.
right, and agent relative objective reasons, which are these are reasons that are tied to the agent, but like we can still kind of recognize them from afar.
Okay.
And then finally we have agent neutral objective reasons, which are fully objective.
Okay.
Right, and the thought here is that as we kind of like step back and try to take this more impartial stance,
Right.
some reasons they're going to like lose their force.
Okay.
We're going to see them differently.
Okay. Okay.
But, importantly, the SEP does clarify that Nagel himself, he didn't intend this as like a definition of agent relativity.
Okay.
Right. So while Nagel did argue that agent relative reasons can't be like fully appreciated from this impersonal perspective,
Right.
that was meant to be a conclusion of his argument.
Right. Not a starting point.
Exactly.
Okay.
It wasn't like part of the definition.
Okay, but could this perspective-based approach still be useful, like in its own right? The idea of like having these varying degrees of objectivity that doesn't really seem like it would clash with particularism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So the LFN notes that, this idea of like more or less objective viewpoints.
Right.
It doesn't have to conflict with, the idea that context is really important.
Right.
Which is, the core of particularism, right? And it also doesn't necessarily commit us to some specific ontology of reasons, right?
Right.
Like we don't have to say whether reasons are facts or whether there's, something else.
Okay.
We can just talk about them in terms of like, how objective they are.
Okay. Okay.
There's also an interesting, like more recent perspective on this that the SF talks about called Lushka's normative force interpretation.
Okay.
And Lushka suggests that, even if we think all value is like ultimately agent neutral, right? Like there's just some objective good out there in the world.
Right.
He says that the strength of a reason, how motivating it is, that could be agent relative.
Okay.
And that's because of, how the agent sees that value.
Right. Okay. So the underlying like good is objective, but like my personal connection to it can make it more motivating or less motivating.
Exactly.
Okay.
But, the ASEP points out that there is a pretty significant problem for this perspective-based approach.
Okay.
And it has to do with like this really basic litmus test.
Okay.
Right. So when we think about agent relative and agent neutral reasons,
Yeah.
generally we think that a good definition is going to classify like egoistic reasons.
Right.
Reasons to benefit yourself. We want those to be classified as agent relative.
Right.
And we want utilitarian reasons.
Right.
Reasons to maximize overall well-being.
Right.
We want those to be classified as agent neutral. Right.
Yeah.
But with this perspective-based view, it's not obvious that egoistic reasons can't be appreciated from an objective perspective.
Right. Okay.
Right. Like there are a lot of arguments that have been put forward, trying to show that egoism is like incompatible with objectivity.
Oh.
But a lot of those arguments, they face challenges.
Right.
Right. And so this makes the perspective-based approach kind of controversial right from the start, right?
Yeah.
Because ideally, the distinction should like frame these debates.
Right.
It shouldn't depend on us having already like decided how these debates turn out.
Yeah, it should be a tool for investigation, not a conclusion.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've looked at these three kind of historical ways of understanding this distinction.
Yeah.
And they all have their problems, but then the SEP offers a kind of a way forward, and it involves going back to that principle-based conception.
Yeah, and so they propose this, what they call modified principle-based approach. And the idea here is to try and capture the intuitive appeal and the clarity of the principle-based view, but to do so in a way that's like sensitive to the concerns raised by moral particularism.
Okay.
Right. And so the key move here is to kind of relax Nagel's requirement of universality for reasons.
Okay, so we don't need every reason to have a corresponding universal principle.
Right, exactly.
Okay, yeah.
So the thought is that, the distinction itself, it shouldn't rule out the idea that a reason in one context might not be a reason in another context.
Right, okay.
Right. And so to do this, they introduce this idea of a default principle.
Okay, default principle.
And this is drawing on the work of McKeever and Rich.
Okay.
And these are basically like, kind of hedged moral principles, right?
Okay.
That can accommodate this particularist holism about reasons, right?
Okay.
So they acknowledge that like a reason can have a certain kind of weight or force, but that can be altered by other factors in a specific situation.
Right, yeah.
Right. So it's kind of
So instead of like trying to like spell out every single condition where pleasure is a reason,
yeah,
we're just going to say pleasure is usually a reason,
right,
unless something else is going on.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so the idea is that, in the holistic view, the force of a reason can be like defeated by other elements of the situation.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, pleasure is generally a reason to do something.
Right.
But if that pleasure is going to come from harming someone,
right,
then that kind of defeats the reason, right? It's no longer a reason to do the thing.
Okay. Yeah.
And then there are also things called enablers, which are like, conditions that need to be in place
right,
for something to even count as a reason in the first place.
Right. Okay.
So default principles are trying to capture this complexity by saying, look, a certain consideration, it is a prima facie reason, meaning like at first glance,
okay,
it is a reason to do something, but, its force can be overridden or modified by defeaters.
Right. Okay. Okay.
And so this is where the agent-relative, agent-neutral distinction comes back in.
Okay.
Right. Because we can use these default principles
right,
to draw the distinction based on whether or not the corresponding principle
okay,
includes a non-trivial free agent variable.
okay, non-trivial.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah. Why is that so important?
Well, because, every reason it's ultimately going to guide some agent's actions, right?
Right.
So just saying that the action is the agent's action,
right,
that's not going to make the reason agent relative, right?
Right.
That's just kind of a trivial fact.
Yeah, it's just a necessary feature of reasons.
Exactly. As Parfit pointed out, even agent-neutral reasons,
yeah,
they require an agent
right,
who can act on them.
Okay.
Right. So what we're looking for is this non-trivial use
right,
where the reason itself is like tied to that particular agent.
Okay.
Or their specific relationships or characteristics,
yeah,
not just their general capacity to be an agent.
Okay. Can you give an example?
Sure, yeah.
Like, how would these default principles actually work?
So let's think about that default principle, P, that we talked about earlier.
Okay.
This idea that pleasure is a prima facie reason.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
So that's agent neutral.
Okay.
Because the only reference to the agent is just the trivial one.
Right.
Right.
It's P's action.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
But now consider a different default principle. Let's call this one P.
Okay.
That says that an agent's own pleasure is a prima facie reason to do something. Right?
Okay.
So here, the inclusion of P's pleasure, right?
Right.
That's a non-trivial use of the agent variable.
Right, because it's not just pleasure in general. It's
Yeah.
my pleasure.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And so that makes this reason agent relative.
Okay. Expert speaker.